about your journey as a teacher, and specifically with NATS maybe, and then the continued misconceptions about teaching children. I know that still exists, and you are luckily are not tired of talking about it. So we'd love for you to share a bit about that.
Okay. Well, the exciting thing is this is not of my origin. I was born into a family that, for me, was consisted of two voice teachers as well as a performer. I come from humble roots. My father was the first person to sing "Yes, We Have No Bananas" in the musical Barney Google. And he was also a classically trained singer. So I've been experiencing voice teaching literally since birth. I was raised at the Hotel Ansonia. Our neighbors were Lawrence Melchior down one end of the hall and Bidou Sayao at the other, both of the Metropolitan stars. And so I was hearing music literally since birth and listening in on my parents' teaching as I was in the crib. So this idea of teaching youth just seems to be a natural evolution, simply because, to quote our academy paper, if I might, a lot of times when I speak on my own behalf, they say, well, he's Robert Edwin and he's controversial. But if I can quote the American Academy of Teachers of Singing, my colleagues signed on to this idea back in 2002. And it was quite a major thing for them to endorse teaching of singing, because they said more specifically, they said, we once said in the past, I'm quoting here, the Academy in the past has recommended that children not engage in formal voice studies. However, upon further investigation, no scientific, pedagogical, or physiological evidence indicates that child voice pedagogy is inherently harmful to children's bodies, minds, or spirits. So here's the Academy consisting of people like Richard Miller and I could go on and on about who has been in and who's in now. But the whole idea is that the pedagogical community seems to be now more and more behind the idea that children are capable of receiving instruction in dance, singing, math, English, and voice. There's nothing terrible, controversial about it anymore, except for pedagogues who perhaps still believe that the diaphragm can sing. So we've got a kind of a flat earth issue that still goes on here. And it's very sad, only because if people would check the facts out, they would find that there absolutely is no evidence other than the fact that a child's voice has to be treated as a child's voice. That doesn't mean they're fragile and break easily, but there's just that sense that the earlier you train somebody to do something properly, the less likely they are to injure themselves, whether that be basketball or tennis or golf or dancing, or in this case, singing. The kids are very, very enthusiastic about their voices literally from birth. And so the idea that we as pedagogues can direct them in a way that they can use their voice healthily, with great enthusiasm, but much more efficiently than perhaps if they went untrained, I think is a blessing. So if it's controversial, the topic is still controversial, I sort of put it in the same category as belting. If belting is still controversial, then it's a sad state of affairs in pedagogy. Because obviously if belting were that damaging, Broadway would shut down, popular music would shut down, R&B, jazz, across the board, and perhaps even opera, because last time I checked, there's an awful lot of women who are singing in chest voice when the notes go below the staff. So there's that sense of again, fact-based pedagogy that says this is really not a big problem, and if it is still controversial, hopefully we can address that in meetings like this, but also bringing out the fact that these issues have been fairly well resolved and addressed in the past.
Wonderful. Thank you, Robert. It's a great way to start this evening. Let me just remind NATS chatters that this is your chat, and we really encourage you to ask questions. A couple ways you can do that. There is a question box, and you can just type the question. I'm the only one that will see it, and at the appropriate time, I'll ask Robert. You also can raise your virtual hand from the control panel, and I can open your microphone, and you can ask a question that way as well. So, so as we continue this evening, please don't hesitate. Peggy, why don't you lead us off with some of your questions?
Well, Robert, you brought something to mind in what you said. I would ask you, do you think that the idea of teaching children being wrong came about because of the way in which children were being taught? In other words, as you said earlier, you have to teach a child as a child, not as an adult. Is it possible that it got a bad rep because people didn't understand how to teach children, or because they tried to make children sound like something other than what they were or was comfortable for them?
I would certainly say that may be a factor. I actually think it was more the case that anecdotally people just didn't teach children. The word came down, do not touch a child's voice systematically or formally until the teenage years. And that's when I started in NATS, when I joined NATS in 1980, that was a fairly common statement. People would say, give them piano lessons, let them join a choir, but God forbid, give them any kind of vocal pedagogy or any vocal technique. So it was almost an assumption that nobody was doing it. So when somebody like me comes along and says, well, I teach children, and I enthusiastically teach children, it became controversial because it was going against the norm. And again, I was thoroughly thrilled when the Academy was willing to sign on in 2002 to basically say we were wrong, that our documents prior to this were wrong. Please do teach children with the idea that if you know what you're doing, and that addresses your point, yeah, there's got to be some understanding of certainly the anatomy and physiology of the child voice, but more importantly, just understanding that the idea of not teaching them is specious.
Yeah, and maybe it came about because of the whole idea of puberty and voice change, and maybe the thought was you can't really build muscles properly until after menses or puberty. But I certainly agree with you that, and if a child is going to sing, if they're going to perform, gosh knows, they need to know how to use their voice and how to protect themselves and what to do and not do. So
I've got professional children who are in single digits. I've had people on Broadway in Annie. I've had people on national tour in Annie. One of my students was Matilda on Broadway at 9 years old. So again, the thought that any of these kids could be doing a fairly intense repertoire without some kind of teaching or training and coaching, again, would be like handing somebody a basketball and saying, okay, here, go figure it out. I'm not going to teach you anything about the technique of basketball or even dancing. Any physical activity should have guidance.
since you teach adults and children, is there a big difference in the way you establish warm-ups for the kids versus the adults? That's a very broad question, but I'm just curious in terms of duration of warm-up or concepts around warm-up. You keep it simpler for the kids, or do you speak a different language with the kids than you do with the adults?
Well, the idea of addressing the age appropriate repertoire and age appropriate voice technique also includes addressing the age appropriate language. So if you've got a 7-year-old child, you're probably not going to be throwing cricothyroid or thyroid muscle groups at the child, although sometimes that's kind of fun. But what I like to do with my children as well as my adults is remind them that singers are not as smart as dancers, because singers have a tendency just to start singing. So dancers just wouldn't even think of that. They always warm up. So the warm-ups, and then Kari, I remember not too long ago, was talking about cool downs. Well, everybody knows that in dance and in athletics, even horses, for Pete's sake, they walk them around the track. So my big thing with whether they're a child or an adult is to say, get your voice warmed up and ready to go so that you can do repertoire more efficiently, and then cool down afterwards. And the warm-ups and the cool downs are fairly similar. They're lip trills, tongue trills, slides, sirens, and they're playful. I think adults need to be playful with their technique as well as children. I don't think as soon as we start thinking in terms of serious voice exercises, I think we're contradicting what we are doing, because it is an art form, and we need to be playful. I've got an awful serious people who come into my studio who aren't terribly entertaining because they're trying so hard to get their technique down. And I said, you need to be a little bit more childlike. Play.
We're getting a couple great questions already. Two people have asked about identifying the physiological difference between children and adult apparatus and therefore pedagogical implications in the studio.
Mm-hmm. That probably can be started by saying kids have a tendency to copy what they hear. This particular culture, which is rock and pop based, the kids do not have a whole lot of role models that are children. There's just not a whole lot of children involved in that. They have a better shot at music theater. But if they're listening to Demi Lovato, if they're listening to Britney Spears, if they're listening to Drake, if they're listening to countless numbers of adults, the tendency is to copy. And the danger, in my opinion, is the fact that if they try and make adult sounds with a child instrument, they're overloading the system and consequently putting their voice at risk. The child can sing very, very loud and very, very high and very, very low. Most of my kids have 3 octaves. Most of my adults have 3 octaves once they get stretched out. But the amount of weight that voice can carry and the amount of pressure that can be put on that singing system is really the variable. So it's not like they have to sing lightly in their head voice. More, it's a matter of they need to make vowel sounds and tonal qualities that do not overload the system, so that it doesn't get into a pressed phonation because they're somehow trying to copy Pink or Kelly Clarkson, who have rather substantial, thick instruments.
And those are things you would say for any, even an adult singer, you know.
Right.
So is there anything specific physiologically that you would like to address that teachers need to be ultra aware of?
Well, again, it's interestingly enough, our academy addressed that when we put out the statement. And so you've got in the first paragraph, numerous clinical studies show that respiration and phonation occur at birth. Intonation normally develops in the first 4 months of life. Articulation of the first words occur about 1 year, and before a child is 2 years old, 2-word combinations are being used. So the fact that the instrument is actually available to do singing at a very early age does not necessarily mean it's designed to do heavy-duty singing. So one of the things physiologically that I'm very aware of is and Broadway is too, by the way, because rarely do you ask children to do 8 shows a week. Usually they're double and even triple cast because they know that there's a fatigue factor. So I think the kid's instrument is not fragile as much as it is developing and growing. And so that a larynx that is at the age of 3 or 4 is going to be substantially less developed than at 5, 6, 7. So you see very rarely kids at an early age on Broadway. I think maybe the earliest I've ever had anybody working was 6. So the instrument, again, can do a lot of very, very, very expressive and even dynamic things. But the variable in many cases is the keeping in a way so that the instrument isn't being stressed to the point where there's some kind of damage possible. That's true with adults as well, but I think it's especially true with children.
I think that probably what the questioners, the people sending the questions are trying to ask, is there a anatomical physiologic consideration? But my guess is that it is your years of experience and the expertise of your subjective listening that decides where that point of overload is. And for those of us like myself who deal with kids rarely and don't deal with Broadway kids particularly, it's very difficult for me, would be difficult for me to recognize where that point of overload occurs. And I think your years of experience gives you that ability.
Well, actually, I would say the symptoms of an overloaded or an overweighted voice are fairly similar to in an adult as they are in children.
Okay.
If the strap muscles are popping out, if the jaw is wobbling, if the tongue looks like a surfboard, if there's a tremendous amount of extraneous shaking because of the overload, that's going to appear pretty much in a child as much as it would in an adult. And then taking into account that even in the child's voice, there are many different tonalities. There are kids who have really, really, really lower, more substantial voices, and other people with a smaller larynx that are going to have a higher pitched or a thinner sound. And the same thing you would do if an adult walked into your studio, whether it be female or male. Let's say it's a male. Are they more inclined to tenor? Are they more inclined to baritone? Are they more inclined to bass? And I think that's true with children. I have kids in my studio who are very angry at me because I will not allow them to do Annie, because their range is not sufficiently high enough to be able to handle the F-sharp 5. So they're wonderful singers, but their voices exist on the lower end, and they may be able to go down. I've had young kids be able to go down to D3, which is the D below middle C. But conversely, they may be rather uncomfortable anything above maybe D5, C5, D5. Annie requires an F-sharp 5. And just like, again, in a role for a tenor, you don't cast a baritone. And in a role for a baritone, you probably shouldn't cast a bass. The same thing with children. I have children who are absolutely fabulous singers who I have threatened them literally. I said, I will not teach you anymore. You will no longer be in my studio if you get involved in Annie, because one thing will happen almost for sure. You're going to strain your voice. You might even hurt yourself permanently. It's that dangerous. And please don't do this. And so I'm very adamant about that. So we have to take in consideration Fach, which you usually don't think about when you're talking about kids. But there is a Fach factor, and there's also a talent factor. And that's the other thing that I find, again, perplexing with pedagogues, is that you're speaking in a generic term. There are very few really talented people in the world. There's a lot of people who are okay. There are some people who are very good, but the really elite singers I find are rare. And I have a studio full of fairly elite singers. I find they're a rare bird, and they're capable of doing so much more because of that talent factor. There are also recreational singers who absolutely are wonderful, fabulous students who may never ever work as a professional. They'll be recreational singers, and hopefully they'll love their recreational singing. But that's the other variable too. So you have a talent factor, you have a physiologic factor. There's no major difference in terms of an adult larynx and a child's larynx in terms of function. There's their vocal folds, there's the larynx, there's the trachea, there's the resonators, the articulators. The system is fairly similar. But again, it's listening to the singer as you would an adult and saying, okay, where does your voice go? Let's go all the way down to the bottom, wherever that is. Let's go all the way up to the top. If you are a belter, how high can you belt in a way that does not indicate that you're yelling or straining beyond your capacities? And then let's see how high we can take the head voice into. A lot of my kids love to go up in the whistle. Right now, I have a competition in my studio to try and take down Adam Lopez, who holds the world's record for highest note song, C-sharp 8, which obviously you all know is off the piano. I've got somebody up to G7, so we're working on that. It happens to be a boy too.
We have about 9 or 10 questions, so let's work through some of these. They're really insightful questions. The first of which, do you perceive there to be an unhealthy expectation or problem placed on children performing in music theater professionally?
It's not unhealthy if, in fact, they find the kids to match up with the rep. It's just like, again, let's relate it to adults. Is everybody suited to do the Queen of the Night aria? Probably not. So you're saying, in essence, if you try and do this, it probably will be unhealthy. The real issue gets down to, is the kid capable of doing what the rep is asking him to do? And there are an awful lot of kids out there who want to do that, who shouldn't be doing that. And that's the job of the casting people and also the voice teachers, frankly, to make sure that they're steering people in the right direction. Back to my Annie reference. I don't think Annie is unhealthy. I don't think Matilda is unhealthy. I don't think School of Rock is unhealthy if the kids have the physical and emotional and psychological capacity to be able to do the role. That's why they have auditions, and the casting people are fairly good at selecting in those kids that are able to do that and selecting out the ones that aren't.
Robert, I don't want to derail the other question. I don't want to interfere with the other questions that are coming, but one of the problems is that you're talking about professional casting, and most people are dealing with kids that are being cast in a high school or junior high musical where the musical director has no idea who should be doing what and is often encouraging kids to do things they should not do.
Right.
And that's what the average teacher is having to deal with, I suspect.
And I totally understand that, again, because I have also recreational singers in my studio. It's even more on my shoulders as their voice teacher to be able to limit them, which is to say, here's what you can do and here's what you shouldn't do. And if you get in a situation where they're asking you to do more than you're capable of doing, perhaps we should talk about this, and you may need to decline the role. You may need to say, geez, I really can't handle this. It's the ego, obviously, and that sense of, wow, I got cast as Annie in the local community theater production, may outweigh the wisdom of the voice teacher. But I think, again, that's our responsibility. We need to know our students. So if they are involved in middle school productions, if they're involved in community theater productions, high school productions, whatever level, we have to make them aware of their range and their capabilities. One of the things I require, I want everybody in my studio to know their vocal range. When they go to an audition, I want them to be able to say, I can sing a G3, and I can belt to D5, or I can belt to F#5, or I can belt to B4. And then my head voice, my upper register goes up to whatever. And know that range. And if the casting person is saying, well, if you push a little bit, you probably can get the F#5 out, then I need to know that, and I need to be able to address that with the parents if it's a child, and especially with the child saying, you know, this is not a good idea.
It's our job as teachers to really teach our students to be their own advocate. That they are on the front line of their own vocal health above and beyond anyone else. And that was so brought home to me last year. One of the ENT voice specialists I work with, within a 2-month period, sent me 4 children, 11 to 15, every one of them pre-nodular, nodular, and every one of them had a ground zero incident of they were being asked to sing over a sickness by the director without any consideration. And
yeah, we've got to be the strongest advocates, and the parents need to be on to this too. And again, part of the issue is my daughter just got cast as Annie. I don't want to take that away from her. And to try and convince a mother, especially a stage mother perhaps, that this is not in her daughter's interest can be a challenge. But again, that's part of our job. It's part of our job to be advocates. And I totally agree with you, Kari, that the kids themselves need to know what they're capable of doing, and put that into a context that we are all limited. I may be a very good singer, but I have limits, and if I know those limits and I function within those limits, I'm going to have a long and hopefully prosperous singing career, whether it be at an amateur level or whether it be at a professional level or somewhere in between.
Right, we have another question about, can you address the male changing voice? What should young men expect, and how does a teacher support them through this somewhat awkward moment in their life?
That is probably one of the best questions ever and needs to continually be addressed. If I can put it in the context of the training that comes before the voice change, I teach a gender-neutral voice pedagogy, and it's fact-based as well as gender-neutral. And what that simply means is everybody in my studio uses their whole voice. There's no such thing as a boy's voice or a girl's voice in my studio. We use the entire voice system. It's gender-neutral. Therefore, all of my boys have the most marvelous voice change experience because they never yodel, they never get the hello, how are you, simply because the mechanism has been maintained in a nice balance. And as the voice change occurs, their voice is sometimes narrow. It's almost like, I like to use the image of an hourglass. It starts out here, and then during the voice change, it sort of narrows down a bit, and then it widens out again. And there is a danger. And I'm one of my absolutely most challenging young men got cast as Jean Valjean in a middle school production of Les Mis, go figure. And fortunately, the music director recognized his voice was dropping, so he kept changing the key. So it'd be like the weekly key change for this young man. And fortunately, he got through the show quite nicely because his voice literally dropped during the course of the show. If the music director is ignorant of what the voice change is all about and continually pushes the boy to try and hit notes that he no longer has, then again, we're back to the advocacy thing. The male voice change can be catastrophic, but I think it's mitigated by the fact that if you have your boy continue to sing through the voice change in both registers, and the word falsetto is forbidden in my studio. I like mode 1 and mode 2. Mode 1 being chest voice, mode 2 being head voice. If you continue with mode 1 and mode 2, the voice change is rarely debilitating or embarrassing, and it just gradually. Sure.
Can I ask a quick question? Do you, if a boy is having a particularly tumultuous voice change, do you alter the technical instruction or the exercise or vowel modification or anything, or not really? Is there anything you do technically?
Yeah, no. Basically, when somebody comes in, and if they're involved in a let's call it a very unnerving voice change, the voice will dictate where it wants to go, and so the technical exercises will be literally, all right, let's try this. Okay, that didn't work. Let's try this.
Yeah,
and sometimes that narrowing of the voice is so substantial that if they are involved in a show or involved in a performance, they may not be able to do that. And there again, that's part of the advocacy, saying, hey, you've got maybe an octave and a little bit more to work with. The song you're singing is an octave and a half, and you don't have that. It's narrowed to this point. We have to let the voice tell us what it wants to do. So it's constantly checking range out. You know, it's kind of like, okay, where are you this week? Oh, okay, you just dropped another half step. You dropped a minor third. Okay, that's where it is now. Let's see what it's like on the top. So if they're involved in performing, there's the danger. If they're in like this boy in Les Mis, if he was forced to try and do the original keys, he would have really possibly hurt his voice catastrophically, and I would have probably recommended that he drop out of the show. Fortunately, again, the music director was savvy and said, okay, we'll just keep changing the key. So God on high, God on high, God on. Eventually, he just kept coming down and down and down. So yeah,
right.
that is probably the most dangerous time in a child's vocal existence is the male voice change.
There's a wonderful dissertation, gosh, 8 years ago now, Jeannie Darnell's about the male changing voice. Have you read? So for anybody looking for it, Darnell. Jeannie is her first name. And years ago when I read it, I haven't read it in years, but I remember it being very useful and helpful. And so if people can't find it, email me, and I'd be happy to send you a copy of it.
And to make Scott happy, can we have a commercial?
Thank you, Inside View Press and Scott McCoy for your sponsorship.
Okay, Inside View Press.
Oh, I see. I love that.
We have a DVD, ironically, called The Kid and the Singing Teacher, which is on voice pedagogy for children, and also we address the adolescent voice. It's got a lot of science, it's got a lot of pedagogy on here, and Scott sells this. So.
Now hold it up a bit closer to the camera, Robert. So this is also Inside View Press, is what you're saying?
Yes.
Yes.
It's called The Kid and the Singing Teacher, and it's really loaded with a lot of pedagogy and science. I did that with Barbara Arboleta, who's a speech path and a voice teacher as well from Boston. So there's information out there, and again, the voice change to me is exciting because in the old days, again, let's talk about anecdotally what happened in the old days. What did they tell the kids? Stop singing. Yeah. That was the general advice to a kid who was in adolescence. Wait till your voice changes and then pick up again. And meanwhile, it goes to seeds. As we all know, it takes 48 hours for a muscle to lose strength, flexibility, coordination, and endurance. And so they're telling this kid to lay off for weeks, possibly months. It makes no sense. The kids who sing through the voice change and manage their voice are usually going to come out the other side a lot healthier and a lot less traumatized, and they don't have to literally reinvent themselves when they do that. Every kid that I've had in my studio has had a very, very good voice change, and a very uneventful one because they kept singing right through the change. Same thing with the girls too. I mean, that does happen. I had a 12-year-old girl in my studio a couple of years ago, and she said, "I don't have any voice today." And I said, "So, can I ask a personal question? Did you just start menstruating?" And she kind of went, "How did you know?" I said, "I'm just kind of guessing." And she literally had her first menstruation was catastrophic. She literally lost her voice. Next one, everything was fine, but it was that kind of traumatic event that we kind of discussed.
Hmm. All right, another question. At what age would you recommend starting children? 3 or 4 is typical for piano, but is it possible to teach a 10 to 15-minute voice lesson at this age?
Well, I'd say facetiously, you know, when somebody calls up and said, "I was told that you're not supposed to start voice lessons until the teenage years. When do you start children?" I said, "How about toilet trained?" And I was being somewhat facetious, but also I think there's a truth to that. If the child is expressing an interest in singing, why not? They're in dance class at 3 and 4. As you said, they're taking piano lessons at 3 and 4. Why not? You know, why not a voice lesson? I've had very young children in my studio, and it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun, and there's that sense of I'm learning to control my voice, which is exciting. There's that sense of ownership. It's like I can actually make it do what I want it to do, rather than it kind of wandering around doing what it wants to do. So I would say for a teacher who's maybe a parent is inquiring, the first question would be, does the child want to?
Yeah.
Because I don't take anybody in my studio who is there because their parents think it's a good idea. So the first question with the kid is, in many cases, is, do you really want to do this? And if they say, no, my mother thinks I should take singing lessons, I don't really want to, I'm not teaching that person. That's to me is a total waste of time and their money. And all it does is put into the child's head that this is like a punishment.
And how long lessons do you recommend, Robert? And we're not talking about kids that you're working with headed to Broadway, but
No, I have some adults who can't last more than 15 minutes. ADD, ADHD. So again, I don't think it's so much an age thing as much as it is a maturity factor and a personality factor. So if you try 10 minutes and they're going splendidly, well, add another 5 or 10 or 20. Maybe it could possibly be that young person could do a half-hour lesson, maybe 15 minutes. So I don't think there's any pat answers, and because human beings are so different that their attention span varies so much, I would say again, it's a grand experiment. I let my students pretty much tell me what they're capable of doing, and then I'm always trying to get them to grow beyond their comfort zone. But a lot of times, you know, they'll say, "Hey, you know, I want a 15-minute lesson." You say, "Okay, fine. Okay, let's see what happens," and then maybe it turns into a 20 or a half hour.
I think you've somewhat touched on this next question with your story about the young lady, but this gal says, my daughter lost her upper register when her voice changed 13 for about 6 months, and then it came back. Have you heard of this? And if so, how do you deal with it?
That I've not heard of. And then I would probably defer to Peggy and you. Has that ever occurred in your experience? I've never run into that long a period of time where the cricothyroid muscle says, I don't feel like working.
Well, that's making an assumption that the voice loss or top range loss was related to the onset of menses. Mm-hmm. It could have been something else. It's impossible to say without her being seen. It may not have been a hormonal shift. It could have been something else. I've never seen that. I've certainly seen girls go through transition in terms of the sense of the voice and the range and so forth, but nothing as dramatic as that.
Kari, have you ever had somebody like that?
Not for that kind of time, without having a diagnose, you know, knowing that there was something specific medically, biomechanically going on, no.
Yeah, no,
oftentimes there are coincidences. Oftentimes there are extraordinary coincidences that occur, but it doesn't mean that one thing is causal to another. So
one can add to that, though, that I think we have a responsibility as teachers to tell our post-pubescent girls that some times once a month things are going to happen they're not going to be happy about. I have girls in my studio who have either a day or two where the swelling is so severe that their range is compromised significantly. And I mentioned to them there are opera singers and Broadway people who have in their contract that maybe one day a month this is not going to be a good day. So again, on an individual basis, I think it's important to share that information and say, let's find out if you're one of those people who simply is not, their voice is not affected at any time during the month. Great, you pat yourself on the back and say, thank you for being lucky. But then there are other people who may be in a very, very difficult situation where they have a big concert or a big performance or a big audition, and it falls on the day where they're hoarse because of the menstruation.
And that falls in line with your fact-based pedagogy, because the better educated a singer is about their instrument, the better care they can take of it, the better performance they can give. I'd like to say one more thing about menstrual cycle symptoms, and that is that a female can have a symptom 1 month and not have it the next. Just because they have it once doesn't mean they're going to have it every single time. Often they do, but sometimes they don't. It's interesting variability, just for general information.
Yeah.
As Peggy so astutely observed, we can't, as voice teachers, assume we think we have. If we hear something, we can't assume we have the information to explain it. It is not our job to diagnose voice issues. That's why we have the specialists, the doctors, the SLPs. And so I'm constantly saying to voice teachers, it's not your job to diagnose. Get them in and seen. And the 2-week mark, if there's something very serious, hoarseness, the 2-week mark is what the doctors tend to say. The 2-week mark, they need to be observed, either if they're recovering from a cold or whatever.
And those of us who are in near metropolitan centers, now I'm right outside of Philadelphia, so it's very convenient for me
I realize that.
To Dr. Sadelov's office. The Children's Hospitals there, CHOP has got a fine pediatric laryngologist there, Dr. Karen Zuer. And in fact, her daughter studies with me, so if she brings her kid over, she has some confidence in my teaching, I guess. But it's so nice to have that. Now, people who are not in an area where there's good care, again, becomes a little bit more challenging. And again, more and more, hopefully, the webinars, the Skyping can connect them with places that would be able to maybe diagnose somebody who is in the middle of kind of nowhere, which is where I am right now. I'm up in the Adirondack Mountains of New York State, and
Wonderful.
Not a whole lot around here except bears and deer and woods. So.
Well, we're so glad you could connect to us.
All right.
Let's work through some more questions. Let's see here. Do you incorporate any Kodali games activities into your voice lessons? They are singing and learning basic musicianship skills.
Is that Kodai?
Sorry.
Kodai,
yeah. I do not personally use Kodai. I use a lot of play, and I require my students to become musically literate, but we make a game out of it. For example, if we're doing scales, instead of just doing random scales, we do the circle of fifths. We do pentatonic scales. We do diatonic scales. We do chromatic scales. And they start to identify musicianship with singing. And I say, again, the earlier age, the better. Then they become musically literate a lot sooner. So I'm not.
And Robert, I know this about you. I think I'm interrupting you. I'm sorry, but don't you like to use words to teach vowel sounds, which I think is really smart?
I like to use words, and I also like to use, and I do this with my adults too because it's fun. We do animal sounds. If a cow is a perfect example of oscuro voice quality. A goat and a sheep, certainly chiaro. And so you can get all sorts of wonderful tonalities in a singing exercise by simply modeling an animal. And for the kids, they seem to kind of sign on well until they get to middle school. Then they think it's kind of weird. But if they've been with me a while, they realize, hey, I do this with my adults. This is not. if my adults are uptight about this because they don't see it as being serious voice pedagogy, then I'm probably doubting their ability as artists, because we are players. We play. And if you can't play in your vocal exercises, I'm wondering what you're doing in your repertoire. Maybe it's those are the people who do the O mio babeno caro and do it as a death song rather than the way it's supposed to be done in Giannaschiki, where it's actually twisting daddy around the little finger. But then again, that's another story. But yeah, no, I like play. I like to call it, it's not an oxymoron. My vocal exercises tend towards serious play, which is to say I have a goal, a pedagogic goal, but the way we're getting there, you probably don't know I have a pedagogic goal.
Mm-hmm. Carol Reingold shares that Suzuki has started a voice pedagogy method. Are you familiar with it?
I must say I am not.
Peggy, how about you?
No, I'm not.
I didn't know anything about that. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. We can't tell you anything.
Wish I could address it. I'd certainly like to check into it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Is there repertoire you would recommend for the very young voice? I find my 5-year-old generally doesn't have an octave range, but it's hard to find methods for them.
Believe it or not, nursery rhymes still serve the purpose, mainly because they do have limited ranges because they were designed for a majority of people to sing. Same thing with folk songs. Same thing with anything that is supposed to be group oriented. The idea is not to stretch the range beyond where it should be. That's why This Land Is Your Land should be our national anthem instead of that octave and a half treacherous thing that people, first of all, don't understand, and most of them can't sing. But there's a tremendous amount of material. I would say if the girl only has an octave at the age of 5, she's probably not engaging all of her musculature. And so if she can do, like, for example, if it's fairly a mode 1 dominant or chest voice dominant, then maybe she can just fool around and kind of do little bird curls like that, tweet, 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 just really to try and get the head voice engaged. Because an octave seems rather narrow for any voice, for that matter, unless there's some kind of issue going on there. But if the kid is encouraged to do the animal sounds, then she may be able to stretch that octave. But if they're singing pop music, that gets tricky because I'm creeped out when 5-year-old or 6-year-old kids are talking about shaking their booty. I think fairly conservative. And when parents think it's cute, I again have a very, very, very problem with that. I don't think it's cute. I think it's creepy. So I like the kids to be singing Disney stuff. I like the kids to be singing a lot of music theater, rep that's out there. Just recently with Matilda, and of course Annie has been around forever. There's a new show called Amelie on Broadway. There's a young Amelie. There's Frederica in Little Night Music. There's much more. Sound of Music is always good. Do Re Mi is an octave. So there's a tremendous amount of literature out there that they don't have to go into. I broke up with my boyfriend, and now I'm going to commit suicide. Pop music is dark, a lot of it, and pop music is adult-oriented. It's highly sexual, and I don't like the kids singing it. First of all, they don't know what they're talking about, and secondly, like I said, I think it's creepy.
What about classical? You address music theater, pop. What about classical for the children?
Roberta from Canada has, and I'm drawing a blank. Hang on a second. I should know this off the top of my head, but she's got fabulous repertoire for children. Hang on a second. I wrote about this just a little bit ago, and all I have to do is find it.
No, Robert has a column in the Journal of Singing, so that's what he's referring to.
Alberta Keys music. And the woman Roberta has these fabulous songs. Dean Blair, 6 playful songs. They're terrific, classically based repertoire for children that are absolutely delightful. The Royal Conservatory of Music has a whole songbook series that's designed for children. Let's see.
Robert, which column is that? Which month are you?
This is March, April 2012 Repertoire for Child Singers.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that goes into some great detail on there. But yeah, again, classical. I have a little 7-year-old girl who has her grown-up opera voice that she occasionally engages, and it's really kind of fun to again expand that out. She's not going to be singing "O mio bambino caro," but just the idea that the child instrument can do very, very wonderful things, and for short spurts, it's kind of fun to have this very heavily vibratoed, very, very, very big sound to just kind of stretch the muscles a little bit, not for any kind of sustaining. But the classical, light classical material is out there and available.
Great. Amy Gray asks, can you share your personal favorite exercise for voice register blending stuff?
Register blending stuff. Okay.
I love that.
Excuse me. It's actually the same one for kids as it is for adults. I like to tell everybody, all of my students, especially kids, I said, you've got two muscles that are basically working here. One we're responsible for what we call the chest voice, and the other one we call the head voice. And I said, these muscles need to learn how to play well with each other, and the only way to do that is to get them to be friendly, which is to say the chest voice has to give up something and the head voice has to give up something so that the registers are blurred. And the best thing to this day for me has always been an arpeggio. Back and forth and back and forth and back and forth on closed vowels initially, because it seems easier to make the transition on an oo or an e, and then gradually work through the vowels till you get to the point where the hardest vowel for most people is an ah, because it's so exposed. But you know, arpeggios, do, mi, so, do, and then maybe the mi on top, and encourage the student to be okay with being ugly. Because dancers, again, I wrote a column, singing with a while back, called Learn to Sing with the Dancer's Mentality, or Teach with the Dancer's Mentality. I find singers don't like to be ugly. They don't like to sound bad. Dancers are okay falling down. They fall down all the time. I have professional dancers in my studio. I have beginning dancers, and they're okay with falling down. Singers don't want to fall down. They don't want to make mistakes, so I have to keep encouraging them. This is going to sound terrible, but it's okay, because in the next couple of weeks, the terrible will start to get better and better, and then gradually that wonderful registers, you're a nice arpeggio, people are going to see, gee, I wonder where she changed registers. But to me, the biggest challenge is to get them to accept the fact that it's going to be probably terrible initially. And that for me is, I don't know, again, in your work, that seems to be my biggest challenge, is get people willing to be bad initially. Mm-hmm. and then see that as a dancer, saying, okay, I'm trying a pirouette, I fell down. You get up, you try it again. After a while, you probably won't fall down. And then you'll try your second pirouette and you start falling down again. So arpeggios, for me, are the best, yeah.
Chris, this is a great question from Christina. What are the best pedagogical techniques for teaching breathing in a way that young students will understand and that helps students not develop tension?
Okay, reading.
Robert, breathing.
Oh, breathe. I'm sorry, breathing.
Breathing.
Okay, what's the best way to teach breathing?
Pedagogical techniques for breathing for the young students.
Okay, again, the young student, the adult student, pretty much breathe the same way. If they're breathing correctly, I like to talk about a 360-degree breath, which is to say I don't have them put their hands on their abdominal area where most people seem to put their hands, because then that becomes like a front-loaded breath. I prefer them to have their hands at their rib cage, so their fingers are on their abs, their thumbs are on their back, and the crook of their hand is on the rib cage, so that if they're taking the kind of breath that we want them to take, there's that sense of 360-degree expansion. That it's going out in the front, it's going out on the side, it's going out in the back to some degree. And I find the kids very, very much respond to that. Sometimes it's helpful if they're lying on the floor to get the prone position sometimes works a little bit better. But that whole idea of not getting them front loaded, where they're trying to stick out, as they like say, well, my choral teacher told me to stick my stomach out, or fill my stomach up with air. Again, obviously not a fact-based pedagogue, but that sense of expansion all the way around, 360-degree breath.
That's the inhale. What do you tell them to do on the exhale?
The exhale is based on the idea that we need to maintain that feeling of inhalation for as long as possible. and that sense of keeping the fullness as long as possible rather than letting it collapse in.
So, and somebody's asking, Robert, that their understanding is that the breath doesn't need to be as big for musical theater. So do you alter that depending on the genre?
Well, I would challenge that because there's some music theater literature that's requires some fairly extensive breathing. So I would say it's not so much how much you take in, it's where you take it. So if you're taking a short breath, it should be pretty much the same as a deeper breath. It should be that the location is the issue to me rather than the quantity. You know, I have in my Messiah book, when I was doing regular Messiahs, I had little check marks for breath, and then I had very large check marks for bigger breaths. But the location of the breath should be the same. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So you don't prescribe to the idea that a particular vocal fold adjustment might require less air per minute of tone than another. In other words, a chest dominant sound in a female might require less air than a mixed voice sound in a classical female singer through the middle.
And
that's where the question stems from.
That's certainly true. So the thing is, again, if we're teaching breathing, that to me comes into the category of phrasing, not breathing.
Mm.
Okay, in other words, the location of the breath shouldn't change. In other words, if I'm taking a short breath, I do that for a short breath, but then when I take a deep breath, I'm down here. So the location, then we're talking about phrasing. So again, my big check marks there. If I'm doing an extended phrase, if I need more air, simply to do the phrase, the location is going to be the same. It's just going to be a deeper breath. So again, we're practicing short breaths, we're practicing medium breaths, we're practicing long breaths, but they're always from the same location. And it depends on the repertoire. So one really can't categorically speak to music theater requiring shorter breaths or longer breaths. If I Loved You, maybe a challenge to even a classically trained singer from Carousel. There's an awful lot of rep in music theater that's extended phrasing. And then in Annie, something, you know, that last, if you listen to the original production of Annie, Andrea McCardle, day, breath, way. And I've got a couple of kids in here saying, do I have to do it that way? And I said, no, if you can do it in one breath, that's showing off, go ahead. And then you have to hold it for 4.5 hours after that. That's the problem.
Robert, somebody asked about my 7-year-old daughter wants to join the praise band at my church. Have you had students interested in contemporary Christian music? And can this style be appropriate for children?
Absolutely. I have people in praise bands. I have kids in praise bands. I have kids who are gospel singers. I have kids who are in R&B, kids who sing in their church. And it's as long as they are working their instrument within its limitations. We're talking basically two strategies. The short-term strategy for all of my students is what can you sing right now without hurting yourself? The long-term strategy is can we get better, and that's going to require some clumsiness and perhaps, again, as I mentioned earlier, falling down. So short-term, if this girl is not going to be asked to do material or repertoire that's beyond her limitations, then it's going to be a great experience for her. But that, again, that's monitoring the director, monitoring the repertoire. And if it's a lot of belting and the kid has been pretty much doing a lot of soprano stuff, then she probably has to build up her belt voice before she's going to be able to participate fully.
One of the hallmarks of maturity is the understanding of delayed gratification and self-restraint. And with children, and especially with the kind of gratification that kids get and the input they get for singing, is it hard to teach them when to stop, how to say no, how to control their voice use?
Yes.
Given how much it means to them?
Yes. The analogy goes to the person who is passionate about playing basketball, and mom is yelling outside, Johnny, it's time to come in, or Mary, it's time to come in. It's 10 o'clock at night. They have the car lights on so they can see the basket, and they just keep going and going and going. And again, the physical endurance of people varies. I have students in my studio who have incredible endurance, and other people a little bit more fragile. And again, it's my job to convey to them their limitations. And if they don't listen to me, or if they don't understand that, then I have to keep talking about the consequences, which is what I use Peggy often as a threat. I said, you know, hey, if you're not going to listen to me, I'm going to send you over to Peggy because you're not getting it. You keep coming in here hoarse, and that's not from over singing as much as it is from yelling with your friends. And I said, I may need to send you over to, so Peggy, you're a threat. As nice as you are, but that's the whole idea. Okay, if you're not going to listen to somebody else, so again, it's finding out people's limitations and then asking them to work within those limitations. And again, you're right. The maturity level is immediate gratification or instantaneous gratification. Sometimes I'm successful, sometimes I'm not. I threaten people with dismissal from the studio. I have a girl with me now who took it seriously. I said, "You're out of here. If you don't stop yelling and screaming, and I feel like you're Humpty Dumpty." She comes into my studio, came into my studio in the past, hoarse every single lesson because she couldn't stop yelling. And I said, I'm not going to teach you until if you don't fix this habit. And the threat was acknowledged, and she's still with me. So other people, they haven't listened, and I'm not going to be to do the Humpty Dumpty thing. After a while, the student just has to, for me, will be just let go, because I'm saying, if you're not going to listen to me, and I'm considered to be a pretty good teacher, then I can't do anything for you. I can't help you. Yeah.
I just want to, there's one other pass by about research. We have a guest, Dana Lentini, who wrote her master's in pedagogy, and her thesis was, she received a master's in ped, and her thesis was on teaching children in the private studio age 7 to 12, which would probably be of interest to this group. You may want to consider posting that somewhere where we could read it.
Please do.
I would like, this person says, I'd like to learn more if there's any research about been done on the physical attributes of the laryngeal mechanism of the prepubescent singer. Peggy, are you, besides the dissertation I've mentioned, have you read anything in the last 5 years or so?
I haven't. It doesn't mean it isn't out there, though. I'm not current on every single piece of research that's there. It could be there.
Okay. I haven't either, but gosh, Dana, I'm sure we'd all be interested in your thesis if it's
More and more people are jumping on the bandwagon of CCM, belting, child voice pedagogy, thank goodness. And so what we're discovering again is more and more what I continually refer to as fact-based pedagogy, which means this is what's actually happening. If you don't believe this is happening, then you're violating the laws of nature, and you're probably going to lose the battle. I would love to see her work, because it's just, again, just like the Voice Foundation, just you go there and this massive amount of contributions to the community, and so much of it goes unread, unfortunately, because again, we still, I'm back to my preacher role, sorry, but why are we still talking about the diaphragm? Why are we still talking about singing from the diaphragm when all of the literature, anything contemporary, talks about the diaphragm and its fact-based role as simply an inhalation muscle that contracts and opens up the lungs and creates a partial vacuum? But to this day, my majority of my kids coming in from schools, choir directors are talking about singing from the diaphragm, supporting the tone from the diaphragm, and not singing from the throat, and I keep telling them, I said, have your vocal folds moved? If they haven't, then you have to sing from your throat, because that's where the sound's coming from. So we're still, after 40 years of teaching, there's a frustration level, some degree, but part of me has to back up and say, okay, we evolve slowly. Human beings have only been around for 200,000 years.
Well, your calm, insightful voice is always appreciated. But as we wrap up, let me just say one thing. Dan has posted that Kevin Skelton has a great publication on laryngeal mechanics of prepubescent voices, Journal of Singing 2007. So Kevin Skelton, S-K-E-L-T-O-N, 2007 Journal of Singing. So thank you, Robert. We're getting lots of thank yous now from everyone coming in. So I can't thank you, Peggy, of course.
Yes, well, thank you for having me. And this topic obviously is not over talked, is it?
No, it is not. It never is. So NATS Chatters, I can't thank you enough for an incredible year. My goodness, we've had some wonderful guests. I'm already working on next year's guests and have lots of ideas. So if you have any ideas, please don't hesitate to email me or contact me through Facebook, NATS chat, anything. If you have any ideas for people or topics that you'd like us to cover, I'm really open to receiving that. Thank you, Scott McCoy. Thank you, Voice Foundation, for supporting us. And we'll see you all next, I believe October is when we'll start again. So thank you very much. Guests, if you'll stay on tonight with me for just a minute, and we'll wrap it up here. Thanks, everyone, for your kind thank yous.